Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to yet another edition of the Aurum CXO Dialogues, where we engage with decision makers to help them get meaningful insights from leading luminaries on the subject matter of the day. The topic for today is defense offsets, challenges and opportunities. Prior to getting to the subject matter experts, I would like to give you a quick overview on Aurum Equity and introduce myself. Aurum Equity is a leading investment bank focusing on mergers and acquisition, fundraisings, and restructurings. We are based out of Gurgaon, Bangalore, and Mumbai. We have a team of 20 people with 4 partners and a host of strategic business advisors who themselves are experts in their field with over 20 to 25 years of professional experience each. You could read a bit more about ourselves at www.aurumequity.com. As a quick personal introduction, I am an investment banker with over 18 years of experience and over 50 closed transactions. I am currently a partner with Aurum Equity. I am an investor on the board of a predictive healthcare analytics company and on the board of a real estate fund. I'm also an active member and past president of the Entrepreneurs Organization Bangalore. I will be your lead moderator this afternoon. I would also like to introduce my second moderator, V. Sunder. Sunder is a strategic business advisor to Aurum on the aerospace and defense industry and assists us proactively with his wealth of knowledge and contacts within the industry. Sunder has over 25 years held several positions, including being the CEO of Joint Ventures, Head Corporate Planning, Head Compliance, Legal and Company Secretary, and Group CFO of Dynamatics, a large and diverse Indian multinational. He has been actively involved in evaluating, concluding, and integrating 5 acquisitions for Dynamatics in his stint there. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to apologize that Air Marshal M. Matheshwaran has had to cancel this at the last minute due to personal exigencies. It is indeed a loss for the webinar, but Sunder has agreed to step in for him where required. Thanks, Sunder. Another distinguished speaker today is Mr. Amit Cowshish, a partner with Dua Associates and somebody who has been an integral part of the Indian Defence Offset Program. Amit is a former financial advisor and member of Defence Procurement Board. During his career with the Indian Defence Accounts Service spanning 35 years, he has worked in various capacities in the Defence Accounts Department and on deputation with the CVC and the Ministry of Defence. He has chaired the committee that reviewed and drafted the Defense Procurement Manual 2009 and its supplement of 2010. He was co-chair of the forum set up to review the progress of all procurement cases under the Foreign Military Sales program of the US government and was a member of the Indo-Russian Working Group on procurement-related issues. Presently, he is a member of the committee set up by the Ministry of Defense to recommend setting up of Defense Procurement Organization. Welcome to you, sir. Here is a summary of what we propose to cover. We will start with a quick overview of the Indian defense industry, followed by a deeper understanding of the Indian Defense Offset Program and its potential. We will then look at the impact that the offset program has had till now, what are the key challenges it faces, and why we are still bullish on the opportunity that the offset program throws up. The session is expected to last around 45 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. We will share details separately with all participants on where they could view this presentation in full, including annexure. I now hand over the mic to Sunder to give a quick overview on the Indian defense industry as a whole. Yeah.
Thanks, Vikram. I'll now take you through the details of the Indian defense industry. India is certainly a very large player in this industry, and worldwide we are the sixth largest in terms of the spend on defense budget that we have. Even though it's not a big chunk of our GDP, it's around 1.65% of the GDP, but in terms of size, it's fairly large. Out of this, a large chunk of the expenditure is on the current account. Almost 70% goes towards the current account, and balance is on the capex. Now, on the capex, a large part of the capex, as of now, is all dependent on imports, and you can see that this has given us a reputation of being the largest importer of defense products in the world. This is not a very good reputation, obviously. In fact, China, which is a very big spender on defense products, is today a net exporter of defense products. So India has a long way to catch up in this sector, and when you see our imports, we still largely dependent on Russia. Of course, that's changing now. We are now increasingly importing from USA, and we also have European countries which are increasing their share. Of late, France has caught up very well. Israel has done a lot of business with India in this segment. One of the main reasons for the defense offset policy is to ensure that we become self-reliant and not keep this reputation of being the largest importer of arms. Self-reliance is not the only reason. Obviously, the foreign exchange that's getting drained now in terms of imports needs to also be arrested. And more importantly than that, I think that defense also is a leader of technology. Quite a lot of technologies that started from the defense sector has gone on to civilian applications, and there are many instances of that, and India needs to also take advantage of this. Being such a big spend that we have got, there's a huge opportunity where the rapid technological developments that are going to come about in the defense sector can eventually be a big boost to civilian applications, and that's one of the reasons that India should focus on indigenization and development of technology in this segment.
Thanks, Sunder. That was a useful introduction to the sector, and one of the key points that you have brought up is the fact that India is the largest importer of arms in the world while being only the sixth largest consumer of the same, and hence the need for improving self-reliance on arms procurement in the interests of national security. Amit, could I request you to please run us through how the Government of India has planned to address this point on indigenous manufacturing through the offset program? What are defense offsets, its history, its stakeholders, and procedures to be followed?
Thank you very much, Vikram. Let us begin with a general overview of offsets. It's very interesting that while offsets are now an acceptable trade practice all over the world, there is no standard definition. And offsets are also referred to as industrial cooperation, industrial participation, counter trade, industrial compensation or economic compensation, or even industrial benefit. Offsets have been used world over by importing countries to leverage their buying power for promoting their own domestic industry, development of infrastructure, execution of specific projects, or for various other purposes. Typically, the offset arrangement is formalized by way of a separate contract between the buyer and the seller alongside the main contract for procurement of products and services. Depending on the offset policy of the importing country, the vendors selling the product or services have to plow back a certain percentage of the contract value in the importing country. Taking the example of India's offset policy, which we'll talk about in greater detail later on, if a contract is for rupees, say, 1 lakh crore, and it entails offsets of 30%, the prime vendor will need to plow back 30% of that contract value in India through various permissible avenues. The vendors are generally not very enthusiastic about the offsets, and it's largely because of the hassles of discharging the obligation. But around 80 countries world over have made very effective use of offsets to meet their specific requirements. Defense offsets in India are of recent origin. Based on the recommendations of the committee set up by the government in 2004 under Dr. Vijay Kelkar, the Ministry of Defense introduced defense offsets in 2005, though it was not till 2007 that the first offset contract was signed. And then, learning from experience, the ministry made incremental changes in the policy in 2006, 2008 and 2011. And in 2012, the policy was completely overhauled. And it was this policy which was later on incorporated in the defense procurement procedure of 2013. The key objectives of the Indian defense policy, which were laid down for the first time actually in 2012, are to leverage capital acquisitions to develop the Indian defense industry by A, fostering development of internationally competitive enterprises, B, augmenting capacity for research, design and development related to defense products and services, and C, encouraging development of synergetic sectors like civil aerospace and internal security. And these objectives, which as I said were laid down for the first time in 2012, have remained unchanged since then. The Indian policy is often criticized for failing to bring in technologies. This is, in my opinion, not a very fair comment because, as you would notice, acquisition of technology per se is not one of the stated objectives of the policy. Basically, there are only two direct payers in the offset contracts. The Ministry of Defense is the buyer and the foreign vendor as the seller, although the foreign vendor can also discharge a part of the offset obligation through his tier 1 sub-vendors under the main contract. A standard template of the offset contract is given in the DPP. This is a simple 2-page document, but it is not a standalone contract. The general terms and clauses which are not included in the offset contract template, but which are included in the main contract, such as force majeure, arbitration, jurisdiction of the Indian courts, use of undue influence, agents, etc., are also applicable to the offset contract. And there is little scope for deviation from this template. Normally, the main contract and the offset contracts are signed simultaneously. For discharging the offset obligation, the prime vendors and the tier 1 sub-vendors require Indian offset partners or IOPs. These IOPs have to be compliant with the licensing and other legal requirements applicable in India. The agreement between the prime vendor and his tier 1 sub-vendor or sub-vendors with the IOPs has to be subject to the laws of India. The Ministry of Defense does not really micromanage selection of IOPs by the prime vendors or their tier 1 sub-vendors, but the details of the IOPs have to be submitted by the prime vendor to the ministry as a part of the offset proposal. This implies that while scrutinizing the proposal, the ministry also examines whether the entities selected by the prime vendor are eligible to serve as IOPs. It is therefore extremely important to be fully compliant with the eligibility conditions laid down by the ministry. This slide shows the avenues through which the prime vendors can discharge their offset obligation and the conditions attached to discharge of offset obligation. It will be noticed that there is a repeated reference to eligible products and eligible services in relation to all avenues barring technology acquisition by the DRDO. The types of products and services which are eligible for discharge of offset obligation are listed in the defense procurement procedure. The eligible products broadly fall in three categories. One, defense products, which range from small arms to software that is specifically designed or modified for development and production of or use in the listed products. Two, products for inland or coastal security. These products range from simulators to, say, bulletproof vehicles. Three, civil aerospace products, which range from composites, forgings, and castings to design, development, manufacture, and upgrade of all types of fixed wing and rotary wing aircraft, aeroframes, aero engines, avionics, instruments, and related components. The types of services and critical technologies that are eligible for offsets are also listed in the DPP. The prime vendors and the IOPs must make sure that the product or service being offered for offsets completely fits into the description of the eligible products and services listed in the DPP. I may add that there is some ambiguity about the first avenue for discharge of offset obligations shown on the slide. While there are various opinions on this, the DPP does not make it very clear as to what distinguishes direct purchase of eligible products or services by the prime vendor from execution of export orders for such products and services. Since the offset contract is a contract between the Ministry of Defense and the prime vendor, the latter is fully responsible for discharge of the offset obligation, even if a part of the obligation is being discharged through the Tier 1 sub-vendors. The reason for that being that the Tier 1 sub-vendors are not a party to the main offset contract. This implies that any shortfall in discharge of the offset obligation by the Tier 1 sub-vendors will have to be made good by the prime vendor, failing which the prime vendor is liable to penalties, which could range from monetary penalties at the prescribed rates to debarment in the event of the vendor ultimately failing to discharge the offset obligation. As for the period of discharge, there seems to be no provision in the DPP for any further extension beyond what is shown on the slide. However, to enable the prime vendor to come out of any difficulty that he may face while discharging the offset obligation, DPP provides for rephasing of the offset obligation. But it should be borne in mind that such rephasing is permissible only within the period of performance of the offset contract. Offset banking was introduced to encourage prospective prime vendors to start earning and accumulating credits in anticipation of bagging a defense contract which entailed offset obligation. Experience shows that normally the bulk of the offset obligation is scheduled to be discharged toward the end of the period of performance. This creates pressure both on the prime vendor and the IOPs, as any default in achieving the target entails penalty. The importance of offset banking lies in the fact that it eases the pressure on the prime vendor to discharge the entire offset obligation, as it can more easily be discharged partly by utilizing the banked offsets and partly by a more realistic phasing of the remaining portion of the total offset obligation over the entire period of performance. It must be noted that there is no provision for offset trading. This implies that the prime vendors cannot buy the offsets earned or banked by other prime vendors. Some would say that this is a limiting factor, but the ministry seems to have taken a conscious decision not to introduce offset trading. The system of multipliers was introduced in 2012 to make offsets more attractive to the prime vendors. It implies that the credit to be given to a prime vendor is calculated by multiplying the actual value of the discharged offset by the prescribed multiplier. For example, if the value of offset discharged is rupees 100 and the multiplier applicable in that particular case is 1.5, the vendor will get offset credit of rupees 150. As for valuation of offsets, it's important to keep in mind that the concept of value addition in India applies to direct purchase or export of eligible products. And value addition is determined by subtracting A, value of imported components and content in the product, and B, any fees or royalty that might have been paid. The changes which have been made in the policy and which are shown on the slide should make life easier for the prime vendors, but there is a certain element of risk involved in invoking these provisions because the proposals are always subject to approval by the ministry. Any delay in acceptance of the proposal or rejection of the proposal, in part or in full, when it is submitted while claiming the offset credit, could upset the prime vendor's implementation plan, making it very difficult to discharge the full offset obligation within the contractual period of performance. There is a similar risk in regard to post-contract rephasing, as this too is subject to approval of the ministry. The request will be accepted by the ministry only if it is considered to be justified. And therein lies the catch, because it's very difficult to say what will constitute justifiable grounds for the Ministry of Defense to accept the request for rephasing. Services as an eligible avenue for discharge of offset obligation have been restored after being held in abeyance in May 2013 with certain conditions as shown on the slide. What requires to be noted is that services related to quality assurance and training, which figured in the offset guidelines of 2012, do not figure in the restored list. Apart from the provision of an overall cap of 20% on discharge of offset obligation through engineering, test and design, and software development, another provision has been made in the DPP for random audit to verify the value of the discharged offsets through this avenue. Even otherwise, there is a provision for audit of offset claims by an officer or agency nominated by the ministry to verify the actual status of implementation of the offset obligation, which boils down to audit of the offset claims before giving the credit to the prime vendor. There is also an additional requirement of CMMI certification for the IOPs, where the discharge through these avenues is envisaged above 5% of the offset obligation. Investment in civil infrastructure is excluded from the list of eligible products and services, even if it is integral to rendering of a service such as maintenance, repair and overhaul, unless, as mentioned in the DPP, and I quote, it is specifically indicated. Now, it's not very clear what is meant by this. One possible interpretation is that if the prime vendor intends to take the credit for investment in infrastructure, he must indicate this in the offset offer. But this still begs the question whether this will be good enough for the ministry to treat such investment as eligible for discharge of the offset obligation.
Thanks, Amit, for the extremely comprehensive and open view of the offset program. I think it helps in bringing a lot of our audience up to speed on the policy and procedural aspects of offsets and the thinking in framing the same and the issues it faces. Sunder, could you please talk about the current status and opportunity that the program brings to the industry?
Thanks, Vikram. Offset as a initiative is of recent origin in India. In fact, you've already heard that it started off a few years back, but actually it's evolving now, and probably a comprehensive offset policy is just being introduced, and it's now part of the latest defense procurement policy. So obviously we've not made much progress in terms of really seeing this offset translating into business for Indian industry. But what's good is that a lot of operational issues, especially the legal ones, the technical ones, which were certainly an obstacle, these things have been cleared. So it's very much likely that in future this would really start impacting in a very positive way the Indian defense industry. Obviously now when you look at the size, there are various estimates that one can make, but certainly it's certainly in the region of $10 odd billion for the next 4 to 5 years, and it could only increase from there. In fact, the kind of contracts that especially the new government is entering into, we can see that there is quite a lot of scope for this size growing. So we've just made a rough calculation of, obviously these numbers are based on certain estimates and assumptions, but when you see here, as per this calculation, we will be having an offset opportunity of $5 billion, $5.6 billion. But even if it is half the size, it's a significant one, because the Indian industry still is not mature enough even to absorb half of this. But certainly as we progress, I think this number of $5.6 billion a year shouldn't be out of reach. Certainly the industry is growing towards that direction.
While I agree there are opportunities, my concern is that the program has failed to live up to its desired objectives. Let me try to articulate this by trying to assess its impact on two of the key areas that the government tried to address with the program. Exports have been rising for the aerospace and defense industry as a whole. They have risen to nearly $4.5 billion in 2015 from a low of $379 million in 2007. It seems that the growth in exports has also coincided with the promulgation of the offset policy in 2005. However, the rise is due to a rise in exports of goods which are components and parts for aerospace and not necessarily products such as tanks, aircrafts, warships, arms and ammunition, etc. Further, as seen in the slide, exports which are in the nature of platforms are mostly to countries other than the ones which have offset obligations with the Indian Ministry of Defense. On the other hand, majority of exports under parts and components are accounted for by countries having offset liabilities with India. The question then is, to what extent is the export of parts and components influenced by offsets? While direct impact seems minimal at this stage, data suggests that the increase in exports of parts and components have increased post-production introduction of offsets. This suggests that offsets have had a role in the creation of an ecosystem which is positive in the long run. Hence, there is a mixed impact on exports with a strong ecosystem being created, but the end goal of self-reliance on indigenous arms products not having been met. The second key point, the response to FDI in defense production R&D and also creation of joint venture arrangements has been lukewarm. Since 2005, the offset policy has retained a key provision as per which foreign companies can discharge their offset obligation through FDI. As per the revised guidelines issued on August 26, 2014, FDI cap in the defense sector was increased to 49% from 26%. However, it's interesting to note that while foreign companies can claim offset credit for their equity investment in joint ventures, all FDI may or may not be directly linked to offsets. The permissible FDI is cumulative and includes portfolio investment, which is not eligible for the purpose of discharge of offsets. And also, FDI can be brought in by companies that either do not have or do not wish to have direct business with the Ministry of Defense in the future. As per the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, the government approved 33 joint venture/FDI proposals worth rupees 25 crores only between 2002 and 2014. Defense was ranked 61 among 64 industries tracked. This was when FDI was limited to 26%. As per data released on March 2015 in the Rajya Sabha post August 2015 to March 2015, when FDI limits had increased to 49%, the FDI inflows have risen to 96 crores, an improvement but not significant enough. Although the value of inflows in 8 months post increase in FDI cap is significantly higher than the cumulative inflows of the preceding years, which is more than a decade, there is no evidence of such inflows being influenced by offsets. There is not a single inflow which is brought in by companies having offset liabilities with the Ministry of Defense. A key point now to see is that with the increase in FDI to 100%, of course through the non-automatic route where government approval is required, will these FDI numbers see a further increase? Question to you, Sunder. What do you think are the reasons for this limited or mixed impact of the offset program?
Yeah, thanks, Vikram. When you see why the offset policy has not been a runaway success in India, I think we need to understand offsets actually is only impacting one side of the business, that is on the demand side of the business, where a demand is being created for defense products and it is for the industry to lap it up. What it is not addressing certainly is the supply side of the business, and that's where I think we have many more challenges. Though the offset policy had been a little more rigid, there are operational issues, things like that certainly were there. But I think the more bigger problems came out of the supply side. When I say supply side, first of all, the defense industry per se has for a long time been a monopoly of the public sector. So private sector has had very little exposure to this industry, the dynamics of this industry, and the kind of returns that the industry can give, the kind of capital that's required for this industry, the long gestation period that is a very significant characteristic of this industry. More than that, I think we do not have an ecosystem for this industry in India because like in automotive, if you see, the industry has thrived basically because of 2 or 3 important reasons. One of them being that the multi-tier structure that is part and parcel of manufacturing of any product is very much prevalent in the automotive sector. We have the OEMs here, we have the tier 1s, we have the tier 2s and so on to support, and this interconnectivity that's there has actually resulted in a very thriving automotive industry in India. Similarly, if you see the industry grows based on have clustering around certain places. Now automotive, you can see clusters in the west, in south, in north, and these clusters basically cater to certain large OEM players who are located in those places, and the culture and the technical skills develop because of that, and that's how the industry grows. And in India, we still do not have that kind of clusters for defense, though Bangalore probably is better than other places, and Hyderabad has certain things, but I don't think we still have matured in to have clusters which can support this industry. But now the government policies and also the initiatives taken by the private sector is leading to cluster formation. For example, there's an aerospace cluster in Bangalore. There are some clusters that are coming up in some other places. So all this will certainly make a difference. So I think the challenges are more emanating from the supply side of the industry and not so much from the demand side, which is, I think, a very good thing for the industry, especially the private sector, to look at.
Thanks, Sunder. I agree that there are concerns, but I know that you still believe in the potential of offsets. As a key part and observer of the industry, I would request you to talk about the opportunities that lie ahead and how does industry capitalize upon the same.
Thanks, Vikram. Certainly, when we look at the opportunities that are available, by whatever estimate it's made, what we have presented here is a estimate made by FICCI in one of their reports. There are many other reports of similar nature. All of them show that this industry is growing, is likely to grow at a very, very rapid pace. Probably this pace of growth will be larger than what we are seeing in the traditional industries like automotive and other sectors, primarily because this is a new industry. There is a compulsion being created for the global majors who are currently supplying large scale defense equipment to India to procure from India because of the offset policy. And then the Indian industry, more importantly, has also realized the opportunity that's available. Now the opportunity is available is of two kinds. One is to grow this business based on the current offset commitments that have been taken up by the large global OEMs who already supplied to India, and the new contracts that are going to come about. And the other one, probably, which I think will be a bigger one, is the need for some of these global majors to source from countries like India. India provides a huge competitive edge in terms of supply of manufactured products, and the advantages that India enjoys today, basically because of its skilled manpower, engineering capability, very, very high cost competitiveness, a good understanding of the quality systems and processes that are required to be adhered to, which I think we have demonstrated in the automotive industry and general engineering industry. The kind of combination that we have, especially the engineering services IT industry has actually design activities and other activities of much higher end business is today coming to India, and there are quite a lot of good engineering services companies which are evolving into becoming a good amount of design houses. And this kind of capability, when you combine it with the manufacturing muscle that India has got, and when I say manufacturing, both from the mechanical engineering side and the electronics side, even the electronics industry is growing very fast. So as a combination, India probably would be a good destination for many of these global majors to source not just components or parts or services from India, but to look at sourcing comprehensive assemblies, sub-assemblies, and probably the full systems from India. I think that's the opportunity that one can see emerging in this industry. Now, if you have to go through numbers, you can see that as per this estimate, India is going to grow into a roughly $100 billion industry in terms of defense spending, out of which 50% probably will be imported and 50% will be made indigenously. So what we are saying is that there is a scope for a huge chunk of this business coming into the domestic segment. Now, while I said 50% of the defense spend, if I take on the capex, it would come to almost $24 billion by FY22, and added to this, probably the estimate is quite conservative in my view, because I personally believe that the sourcing opportunity that India will provide once we have a booming private sector in this segment will lead to much larger growth. But even taking it on a conservative basis, you could say that this would grow into a $40 billion industry by 2022 compared to what it is today, a $6 billion. And I think this $40 billion would predominantly be dominated by the private sector, which probably is a minuscule player today. So that's the kind of opportunity one can look at in this segment. Now, if you see, as of now, a large part of the offsets are happening on the aerospace side. In fact, in my view, this is surprising because aerospace is a more complex industry to handle, and India has been fairly successful. In fact, I have come across a large number of mid-sized companies which are meeting the exacting standards of Airbus and Boeing, and they are becoming a good base for sourcing. In fact, many of the programs that they are getting today is not just driven by the offsets, it's just driven by the compulsions of these companies having to source from India for cost reasons, for de-risking probably because they're sourcing already quite a bit from China and certain other countries, and also for the kind of legal systems that India has got in terms of protecting IP rights and stuff like that. Plus our huge engineering workforce, which probably makes it very easy for them to even start design and developing these products in India. So this kind of growth that we've seen in aerospace probably is also because our purchases in the aerospace sector has been faster than in the other sectors. But you're seeing now large contracts happening even on the land systems. Recent case in point is the light howitzers, which the government has signed off with BAE, and this entire contract was going to be handled by Mahindra as a joint venture with BAE. So for the first time, it's not going to be in the ordnance factories, but it is going to happen in our private sector. Now you will see this being a big driver of creation of a huge supply chain for various components that are required to make these howitzers. In fact, a large part of the howitzers are mechanical engineering and electronic parts, which I think the Indian industry is very much geared to meet the requirements. So this is only the beginning, because we have a huge backlog of guns and ammunition and various other systems that are required for meeting the needs of our armed forces. The other one, I think, which again is very, very interesting and which is also set to grow very fast, is our naval systems. Here again, we are seeing some big players like L&T has done a good amount of work here, and going forward, we see many more private sector companies setting up joint ventures to meet the needs of our Indian Navy it's the ships, the submarines, the various other systems that are required will be driving this industry in a very big way. So pretty much each of these sectors would grow into $25+ billion kind of size. And my personal view is that when we see the land systems and naval systems growing, we'll see a faster rate of growth in the private sector, especially because most of the parts and systems that are required for these products are very much within the capability of our private sectors to handle. And the needs, the standards, all that certainly the Indian industry can meet. And you can see this growing in a very big way. Now, as we were discussing earlier, any of this kind of growth can happen only when it starts clustering around certain geography, where you start seeing specialization happening in terms of skills, in terms of the kind of infrastructure that's required, because there's going to be huge costs that will come about in terms of putting up infrastructure for not just manufacturing, but for testing, for special processes that are required to support manufacturing, for various kind of services that are required for this industry. More importantly, the logistics part of it in terms of catering to the end customer. So all this will require an approach that we've seen that's happened in the automotive sector. In fact, my personal experience is that the large scale growth that we saw in the automotive sector came about because of these clusters. In fact, in the south, we saw quite a lot of automotive activity happening after TVS started making their bikes here, and the whole ecosystem started developing around that. The whole concept of quality, the Japanese quality systems and other things that we in the South are so proud of started because of this. Immediately after that, we saw Hyundai coming up and setting up a fairly large manufacturing facility in Chennai. And around that, we've seen a very, very rapid growth in the supply chain, and the quality systems that was brought about by Hyundai, the kind of efficiencies that they drove into the supply chain has really, really contributed in a big way to Chennai becoming now the hub for small cars. Probably we are, called as the Detroit of India, and very soon probably this will be one of the largest geographies where small cars are going to be made. Now this has led to the development of the other sectors that are required in terms of logistics, in terms of harbor getting developed for exports, and many other things that are required. So this kind of activity is likely to also drive the growth in the defense industry. For example, Bangalore has already started showing signs of becoming a cluster for aerospace industry. We've seen a lot of players who are already suppliers to HAL growing and graduating into becoming suppliers to large tier 1s or even the large primes. In fact, a small company in Bangalore today is a supplier to Boeing as a tier 1. Of course, Dynamatic is now very well known as a supplier of a very flight critical product as a flap track beam to Airbus for all the A320s they make in the world. And this is not a business that was driven by offsets. This is for civilian application. It was just driven by the need for Airbus to source from countries like India, and companies like Dynamatic have risen up to the challenge, and today they do supply to more than 50 odd A320s or the A320 family of aircrafts made by Airbus. So we can see many more good examples like this coming up very soon, where you will see flight critical parts being made. And Bangalore already is coming up with a aero park near Devanahalli, and a lot of activity is there coming up in that region. And we've seen Wipro has set up a factory there. Dynamatic is constructing one. We have other players who already set up small factories, and some of the large players are just proposing to set up huge establishments. So I think that will be one of the key hubs for development of the aerospace business. Similarly, we're seeing something coming up in Hyderabad, and Hyderabad again has a very strong defense base, and many industries are now clustering around the Hyderabad International Airport, where there's a large SEZ that has been set up. Chennai has just announced SEZ, which again is attracting a lot of industry. In my view, Chennai would become very prosperous in this segment, basically because Chennai has the scale in terms of engineering industry. Chennai has the requisite skill sets, quality consciousness, the commitment of promoters in setting up large projects. So I personally feel that Chennai would develop into a very important hub to cater to the needs of the industry. North, we can see good amount of activity happening in the NCR region, where again I think there will be good activity. Reliance is planning a fairly large establishment there, and that could drive quite a few big players entering that field as tier 1 suppliers, and from there on we could see multi-tier structure developing in that place. So again, North has a very strong ecosystem for automotive industry driven by Maruti, and that ecosystem would be a very good support to the ecosystem that's required for defense industry. Similarly, on the west, again, Pune probably would be a very good geography to support this industry. Pune has traditionally been the automotive hub of India, where we've had two great homegrown companies, Mahindras and Tatas, there for a very long time. And both of them are entering. Of course, Tata's major part of their investment is in Hyderabad as far as aerospace is concerned. But I think Mahindras are getting into defense industry in a big way. Bharat Forge has made good headway, and we've seen other major players also coming up in this segment. So West again has a huge promise in terms of developing as a very strong cluster. So with all these clusters coming up, we will see this multi-tier structure, which is very important for the defense and aerospace industry to develop. The only thing probably that needs to be seen is whether the OEMs will set up large facilities in India for complete assemblies, like not the full aircraft probably, but for making the whole wing or for making the whole fuselage, stuff like that. Because ultimately it's the OEM, when we talk for TVS or a Hyundai or a Maruti, which drove the growth of the supply chain. So one of the big things that we look forward to is that the OEMs coming into this industry in a big way, and probably that will happen when these clusters develop into very reliable supply chains to these industries. And when that happens, I think the numbers that we've given would just be the beginning. We will see this industry growing many more times than what's been stated here. Yeah, in terms of the industry growing, the other necessary requirements probably are things like raw material sources. We've seen that India does not have the requisite ecosystem for procurement of raw materials, because most of the raw material required, the alloys here required or the other materials that are required are very specialized, and since the industry has been in a very nascent stage here, we do not have many big suppliers of such raw materials. But what we've seen of late, like companies like ThyssenKrupp, which are global majors supplying into this industry, they are setting up warehouses. In fact, ThyssenKrupp has set up a warehouse in Bangalore, in near Devnalli, and from there they are able to meet the needs of the industry, not just the needs of timely supply, but more importantly, the quantities that are required. One of the challenges of the industry has been that we've not been able to get the materials that are required in small quantities, which is what they needed because of the small size of the industry. Now, with warehouses coming up, this is met, and this is going to be a big driver of growth. And like ThyssenKrupp, there are others who have also set up warehouses in India. So I think that's one of the crying needs of the industry that's slowly getting met. Now, in terms of offsets, of course, we've talked about liberalization that's happening, and a lot of initial teething trouble that we've seen getting sorted out. So this would certainly be a big driver of growth. The third most important thing is the people side. I think there's a huge amount of investment that the government is making on skill development. We've also seen a sector skill council being set up under the NSDC along with HL, and that's going to be a very important base for creating skilled people. Similarly, we've seen other sectors also where the skilled people are getting developed in the automotive and other engineering industries, who would be very much suited to support this industry. So we've seen that activity also picking up. And obviously with the global growth that we're seeing, the political climate that's changing, I see a lot more investment coming up in this sector. And with all that, we are very, very optimistic about the growth in this sector. And one of the biggest drivers of this growth probably will be the kind of M&A activity that we may be seeing going forward, where smaller players are going to be acquired by large groups, and on the shoulders of such smaller players, we'll see huge enterprises being built.
Thank you, Sunder. It is heartening to note that there is not just a sliver but a large ray of hope on the horizon for the Indian defense industry through the offset program. I would now like to open the debate for questions. Please do enter your questions in the text box provided in the webinar window, and our technical team will pass the same on to us. In the interest of time, we will attempt to answer just 3 to 4 questions now, and for the remaining, we will send in responses via your registered email ID. Thanks. Amit, the first question has come in for you. And the question is, will wholly owned subsidiaries qualify as Indian offset partners?
The DPP defines Indian offset partners as Indian enterprises and institutions and establishments which are engaged in the manufacture of eligible products or providing eligible services. It also says that the IOP, besides any other regulation which may be in force at any given point of time, has to also comply with the guidelines and licensing requirements stipulated by the DIPP. So basically, an IOP has to be an Indian vendor or an Indian entity. Now, DPP 2016 also defines what is an Indian vendor or an Indian entity. And it says that for defense products which require industrial license, an Indian entity could include incorporation ownership models as per the Companies Act, partnership firms, proprietorship, and other types of ownership models, including societies as per the relevant laws, which comply with, besides other regulations, enforce the guidelines and licensing requirements of the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion. And for defense products which do not require industrial license, any Indian entity which is registered under the relevant Indian laws and complies with all regulations in force applicable to that industry will qualify as an Indian entity. Now, in this background, in my opinion, there is no bar in the DPP on a wholly owned subsidiary being considered as an IOP. However, having said that, let me also add that as per my understanding, the position is not very clear. This is an issue which was being raised repeatedly by the industry in the past, and considering the fact that DPP 2016 does not specifically say that wholly owned subsidiaries will be eligible as IOPs, I think the jury is still out on this issue.
Thanks, Amit. Sunder, the next question is for you. Public sector will continue to be a large source for defense equipment. Procurement policies and PSUs, especially norms like L1 for purchases, have been a big disincentives for long-term players in entering this sector. Is this changing now?
Yeah, as you rightly pointed out, public sector will continue to be one of the major players in this industry. We cannot wish it away. We have a huge infrastructure in India, both for aerospace. HAL has a huge facility. Similarly, we have the Mazgaon docks and other companies in the Navy, for the Navy. And we've got the ordnance factories, quite a few of them, catering to the armed forces. Now, this will continue to be there. Now, as far as change in the policy, as of now, there is more buoyancy, there is more transparency. In fact, if you go to any of the websites of these public sector units, you will be pleasantly surprised to see the kind of transparency that they have brought about in terms of what they would like to outsource, more importantly, what they would like to indigenize. In fact, every single department, major department of these companies have now got an independent officer to look after indigenization, and he reports up right at the corporate level, where a very senior officer has been nominated as the head of indigenization. And they have done a very exhaustive study of the various components, parts that they need to indigenize, and they have put it out on the website. And from there, one can pick up what one thinks they are competent to make and approach these companies. And I have seen my personal experiences that they're far more receptive nowadays. They certainly actively look forward to larger players entering this sector, and they're probably better placed when dealing with indigenization compared to outsourcing, because the benchmark prices in indigenization are the imported products price, and that gives adequate elbow room to larger players to establish long-term capacities for meeting the needs of the public sector. So basic L1 principle and other pricing issues have not changed so drastically, but I'm told that's also there as part of the policy. There is also probably you're going to see many more joint ventures happening between the public sector and private sector, and sourcing norms for these joint ventures will certainly be more liberal than sourcing norms that are applicable to the main company. So you will see multiple actions happening for liberalizing this procurement policy, and that will certainly be a big boost to the private sector. I certainly think there are positive changes happening.
Thanks, Sunder. Amit, another question on IOPs for you. Is there a specific system of registration or certification by the Defense Offset Management Wing?
No, there is no system of registration or certification of IOPs by DOMW or by any other agency of the Ministry of Defense. It's up to the Indian entities to approach the foreign vendors and talk to them and forge tie-ups. While one of the duties assigned to the DOMW is to assist the vendors in interfacing with the Indian industry, but this is an area where DOMW has a lot of catching up to do. What DOMW does, of course, is to offer and provide any clarification that anyone may need in regard to any aspect of offsets. And to facilitate this, it has opened up a cell called the Facilitation Cell, which operates from Central Marketing Scope Complex, Lodi Road, New Delhi, and which is manned by officials from DOMW throughout the week. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays, on Tuesdays in the forenoon and on Thursdays in the afternoon, you have a team of MOD and DOMW officials also available in that facilitation cell to give you any clarification that you may need on various aspects of offset policy.
Thanks, Amit. We will now take two last questions directed at Sunder, since these are both quite relevant, one from a timing perspective and one from the perspective of Aurum. The first question, Sunder: scams like Augusta Westland are perceived as a major risk in this industry. Could you comment on this? And the second question, since you had touched upon M&A activity, would you like to speak a little more about it, and what role does private equity play in this entire thing?
Of course, scams are part and parcel of this industry. I don't think it's very peculiar to only India. This industry is bedeviled by scams like this in many parts of the globe. Of course, India has a larger share of them, and probably we get a much more publicity for such negative news than positive news that's happening. Be that as it may, I think these are very bad examples. Augusta Westland, there are many more such scams. We've heard of Bofors in the past. All this has certainly slowed down the industry. In fact, the howitzer purchases which is happening now is probably happening for the first time after the Bofors scam. So the Indian armed forces have been starved of such guns for such a long period, thanks to a scam like Bofors. So these kind of things, while continue to be, one can say, a risk for this industry, what I personally feel is the kind of policy changes that we are seeing and the kind of transparency that's being brought about by the government and the kind of rigorous processes that are being set up by the forces in terms of acceptance and stuff like that. Certainly, there's a very positive movement that we're seeing here, and probably we'll see less scams going forward, and we will see more real business happening. So things are certainly better off today than what they were earlier. Coming to M&A and private equity, I think M&A, I strongly believe that M&A will be a big driver of growth in this industry. This also because if you see, this industry has been dominated by the public sector, and what the public sector has done is that it has created a huge supplier base of small and medium companies who've willy-nilly gathered all the requisite skill sets and requisite competencies that are required to service this industry, but they have not grown, obviously because of the limitations of being small scale industry, and also the limitation in terms of being a supplier to public sector companies. But certainly these companies have all the requisite skills and competencies that are required to scale up, and that are required also to address the needs of larger players from the international level. Now I see a lot of Indian private sector who are very large already in their existing businesses would need to grow faster in this segment if they have to leverage the opportunity that's available, and that they will not be able to do by setting up greenfield ventures. The only way they could do that is by acquiring such companies and scaling them up. We're already seeing quite a few examples of that now, and there are going to be many more that will happen going forward, and that particular sector I'm very bullish about. Coming to private equity, I do not see much happening from the private equity side, especially because of the long gestation period, quite a lot of technology challenges that are there in this sector, and probably the lack of understanding of this sector by many of the current private equity players in India. Of course, there are specialized private equity funds for different sector globally, but they wouldn't want to rush to India considering the various legal and other challenges that are there. So that will take more time to happen. But what I see that the capital being made available will probably come from strategic partnerships, either between a supplier and vendor, or co-investment that can happen by certain large players having complementing capabilities. And I also think that joint ventures would also come up in a big way, especially now that there is a relaxation in the norms. 49% comes under automatic route, and they can go up to 100% by obtaining the necessary approvals. So probably the growth or the need of capital will be met more by this kind of activity than private equity.
Fantastic, and long live mergers and acquisitions. That's great news for investment banks such as us. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now close and answer the rest of the questions via email. On behalf of all of us at Aurum, I would like to thank Sunder and Mr. Amit Cowshish for their valuable insights. I do hope that the webinar was informative to you all, and we will send you the answers and the presentation link via email. Thank you for registering and look forward to being in touch.